of the dead. Eli Crane tightened his welding mask and leaned over the table, the hiss of the torch drowning out the storm. The alien woman lay motionless, her silver hair spread across the scorched surface, her chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Her body was not like any he'd ever seen, part flesh, part fractured alloy, broken where once there had been perfection. He should not have cared, but he did. He had found her among the wreckage of the battlefield, half buried under twisted steel and the smoldering ruin of a warship that didn't belong to Earth. Most of his people had fled the region, terrified of the fallout from the interstellar clash that humanity had stumbled into. Eli should have walked away too. But something in her eyes, before they closed in pain, had anchored him. It was not the gaze of a conqueror or soldier. It was the gaze of someone unwilling to surrender. The damage was catastrophic. Both arms gone below the shoulders, legs twisted into unrecognizable shards of bone and metal, her torso laced with gashes deep enough to expose circuitry pulsing weakly beneath pale skin. She was a miracle in the sense that she was still alive. Human medicine could not help her. Earth tech wasn't built for beings like her. And yet Eli, a backwater mechanic known for repairing old mining rigs and salvaging broken droids, had decided he would try. The torch sparked again as he fused a joint along the newly fitted prosthetic, the acrid smell of molten metal mingling with the faint scent of ozone. Her skin twitched near the seam where alloy met flesh, and Eli paused, heart pounding. He had no manual, no guide. Every adjustment was a guess, every weld a gamble. The woman murmured something in her sleep, words guttural and sharp, not of any human tongue. He swallowed hard and pushed on, his hands steady despite the storm of doubt in his head. Hours bled into each other as he worked. The outside world faded. The war, the fear, the possibility of being hunted down for harboring an enemy. All that mattered was the fragile thread of life tethering her to this world. The more he worked, the more he began to see her not as alien, not as other, but as someone broken and in need of saving. And saving was something Eli knew too well. He'd lost too many people he couldn't fix. Not this time. When the generator flickered, he cursed under his breath and kicked the side of it until it growled back to life. Sparks danced across the makeshift lab, throwing shadows across her face. Her features were strangely human. Angled cheekbones, a delicate nose, lips cracked but soft. If not for the luminescent veins glowing faintly beneath her skin and the metallic ridges of her ruined frame, she could have passed for one of them. Eli caught himself staring too long and shook his head. This wasn't the time for wonder. He set down the torch and reached for the tray of scavenged parts beside him. Most were ripped from machines he had cannibalized, stripped bare of function, but still housing fragments of use. He wasn't building her arms or legs to be beautiful. He was building them to work, to let her stand again, to let her live. The design was crude compared to what she'd once had, but it was survival. And survival, Eli knew, was enough. The night dragged him into a rhythm. Weld, solder, adjust. Check her breathing, repeat. His mind slipped into focus, every move deliberate, every error immediately corrected. Sweat pooled beneath his collar, despite the cold draft slicing through the hangar. Somewhere in the back of his thoughts, he knew he was trespassing on something sacred. She was not meant to be his responsibility, and yet fate, cruel and unrelenting, had left her on his table and no one else's. Her chest rose sharply, then faltered. Eli froze. The faint glow beneath her ribs flickered like a dying flame. He dropped the tools and pressed his hands against her torso, desperate, clumsy. No, not yet. Not now, he muttered, as though sheer will could bind her to the world. He had no training in medicine, human or alien, but he refused to lose her. He scavenged wires, connected them to his generator, and prayed she functioned close enough to a machine to accept the surge. The current surged into her body, and for a terrifying second she convulsed, her back arching off the table. A strangled sound tore from her throat, half scream, half growl, and Eli almost ripped the cables away. But then the glow steadied, the flickering stabilized, and her breathing returned, shallow but consistent. He sagged forward in relief, trembling, realizing just how close he'd come to failing. His hands shook as he wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of grime behind. The rain outside had become a curtain of noise, masking the silence within. Eli stared at her face, pale but alive, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't supposed to care, She was alien, unknown, maybe even dangerous. But to let her die when he could prevent it, what kind of man would that make him? Humanity had survived by refusing to give up, by clawing its way through the impossible. Maybe that was why he couldn't let her go. Maybe at her core she wasn't so different. He leaned back exhausted and adjusted the straps holding her to the table. Her body twitched occasionally as the makeshift circuits adapted to their crude replacements. He wondered if she would hate him for what he had done, replacing grace with rust, beauty with utility. Or maybe she would never wake up, and this would all be for nothing. He pushed that thought aside. He couldn't afford to think of failure. Not now, not with so much already lost. The storm finally began to quiet, though the hangar was still cloaked in darkness. Eli checked the seams along her shoulder, the points where metal met skin. The fit was rough but functional. He tried to imagine her standing again, silver hair falling across alloy limbs, rebuilt from the wreckage. Something inside him whispered that this was more than repair. This was resurrection, a kind of defiance against everything the universe had thrown at them. He sat beside her, the fatigue clawing at his eyelids. For a while he simply watched her breathe. Each inhale was a reminder that his gamble wasn't in vain. Each exhale was proof that she still clung to the fragile thread of life. He wanted to ask her questions she couldn't yet answer. Where she had come from, why she fought, what she had lost. But most of all, he wanted to know why she had survived when so many hadn't. What made her different? A faint sound cut through the silence. At first, Eli thought it was the wind, but then he realized it came from her. Her lips parted, trembling, and a whisper escaped. He didn't recognize the word, but it was deliberate, a name or a plea. He leaned closer, straining to hear, his heart hammering. She whispered again, softer this time before her head shifted weakly against the table. It was the first sign of consciousness since he had found her. She was coming back. Eli swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't know whether to speak to her or let her rest. He chose silence, unsure if his words would mean anything to her at all. Instead, he adjusted the blanket draped loosely across her chest, covering the jagged scars of his work. He could not give her back what she had lost, but he had given her something else, a chance. Whether she hated him for it later was irrelevant. He had chosen to act, and that choice defined him. The minutes stretched into hours, and Eli drifted in and out of a restless half-sleep. His chair creaked whenever he shifted, the only sound besides her steady breathing. He dreamed of fire and smoke, of a battlefield not his own, of her eyes meeting his across a gulf of destruction. When he jerked awake, the images clung to him, leaving him shaken. He looked at her again, reassuring himself that she was still there, still alive. That was enough to quiet the ghosts for now. In the faint grey light of dawn, the hangar looked different. Dust floated through the air like ash, settling on the scattered tools and broken machinery. Eli stretched, bones aching, and checked her pulse, or what passed for one. Her skin was warmer now, the faint glow beneath it stronger than before. She was stabilizing. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. He knew this was only the beginning. Rebuilding her would take more than scavenged parts and stubborn hope. Her fingers twitched. The prosthetic joint creaked as it moved, slow and halting, like a newborn testing its first breath. Eli's chest tightened as he watched. She was adapting, her body accepting the alien grafts he had cobbled together. For a moment, he felt like an intruder on something intimate, witnessing her reclaim what had been stolen from her. He had given her the tools, but the fight to live was hers alone. She stirred again, her eyelids fluttering, and this time when her lips moved, the sound was clearer. Still foreign, still alien, but laced with desperation. Eli leaned closer, brow furrowed, trying to piece together the syllables. It sounded almost like a question. He shook his head slowly, whispering back, "I don't understand." Her eyes cracked open then, just enough to reveal a faint glow within, like twin shards of starlight burning weakly. And in that instant, everything changed. Eli had seen death in countless forms. He had watched miners suffocate in collapsed shafts, soldiers bleed out in the dirt, families starve when supplies ran dry. But in her eyes, half-lidded and barely focused, he saw something he had never witnessed before. It was not surrender nor even pain. It was fury, a silent, burning refusal to be extinguished. Her gaze locked on him, and despite the weakness of her body, he felt the force of her will like a blow. His breath caught, and he realized with startling clarity that he had tethered himself to something far larger than his lonely life in the ruins. He wasn't just fixing a stranger. He was becoming part of a story that reached beyond Earth, beyond humanity. The alien survivor on his table was not simply a casualty of war. She was a survivor who would not yield. And by saving her, Eli had bound himself to whatever came next. The glow in her eyes flickered, then steadied, before she sank back into unconsciousness. Eli exhaled a shaky breath and leaned back, his body trembling with the weight of what he had just seen. The storm outside had passed, but inside the hangar, a new one had begun to stir. The morning stretched into a grey silence broken only by the hum of the generator and the occasional crackle from Eli's welding torch. He had begun work again, fine-tuning the rough joints he had pieced together through the night. His hands moved with care, each adjustment measured as though he were sculpting something fragile and irreplaceable. The woman's breaths were steadier now, less erratic, and that gave him a cautious hope. He told himself that as long as she breathed, he still had a chance. He paused to wipe the grease from his palms, staring at her face. Her features were sharp and dignified even in unconsciousness, framed by hair that shimmered faintly silver in the dim light. She looked peaceful for the first time since he had pulled her from the wreckage. That peace unsettled him. It felt too much like the quiet that came before death. He shook the thought away and forced himself back to work, refusing to let fear dictate his hands. By midday, the rain had lifted, leaving a faint mist clinging to the mountains beyond the hangar's shattered windows. Eli ventured outside briefly to scavenge from the wreckage, careful to stay hidden from any scouts that might still sweep the area. Every step reminded him of the risk he was taking. If the authorities discovered he was harboring an alien, they wouldn't hesitate to kill her or him. Yet every bolt and circuit he stuffed into his bag felt like a declaration that he would not abandon her. When he returned, he found her stirring again, her body twitching beneath the straps that held her steady. Her eyelids fluttered before she gasped, a sharp intake of breath that made Eli drop his tools in alarm. He rushed to her side, watching her eyes snap open. They glowed brighter this time, like burning coals trapped beneath glass. She struggled weakly against the bindings. Confusion etched across her face as she tried to make sense of where she was. "Easy," Eli murmured, his voice low, careful. He raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. You're alive." He doubted the words meant much to her, but he said them anyway. Her gaze darted across the hangar, narrowing at the sight of scavenged machinery and crude welding seams along her limbs. Then her focus snapped back to him, piercing, unyielding, as if demanding answers he wasn't ready to give. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, and the sound that emerged was broken, harsh. Eli fetched a canteen and tilted it carefully to her lips. She resisted at first, glaring at him, but eventually she swallowed. Her voice, when it came again, was still alien, a language he couldn't hope to decipher. But the cadence was urgent, desperate. She repeated the same word 3 times, her expression fierce. Eli shook his head slowly, helpless, and whispered, "I don't understand." Her frustration was palpable. She clenched the new prosthetic hand he had built for her, the crude fingers trembling as they responded to her command. The effort seemed to drain her, leaving her gasping against the table. But Eli could see the determination burning through her exhaustion. He had seen that same fire in miners, refusing to abandon their trapped comrades, in soldiers dragging broken bodies through mud. It was the stubbornness of survival, and it resonated with him deeply. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Eli busied himself with minor adjustments, tightening screws, stabilizing circuits, anything to mask his discomfort. She watched him with an intensity that made him uneasy. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A savior, a captor, or just another creature meddling with things it couldn't understand. He forced himself not to care. What mattered was that she lived, not what she thought of him. Eventually she relaxed, her head sinking back against the table. Her eyes flickered shut, though Eli knew she wasn't fully unconscious. He took the chance to breathe, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. Saving her was one thing. Keeping her alive in a world that wanted her dead was another entirely. And for the first time, he wondered if he had the strength to see it through. The day slipped away, shadows stretching across the hangar floor as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Eli lit an old lantern, the warm glow casting soft light over her still form. He sat nearby, repairing a broken drone part to calm his nerves, though his eyes kept drifting back to her. Each time he caught himself, he muttered curses under his breath. She wasn't his responsibility. She wasn't his anything. And yet he couldn't seem to look away. The silence broke again when she stirred, her voice rasping with faint strength. This time the words came slower, more deliberate, as if she were trying to shape them for him. Eli leaned closer, straining to catch the sound. He couldn't understand, but the tone was softer now, less desperate, almost questioning. Without thinking, he placed a hand gently on hers, the metal one he had built. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, her gaze softened just slightly, and her lips trembled as if forming a fragile truce. Eli didn't know what that moment meant, but he felt it in his chest, a strange warmth he hadn't felt in years. It was dangerous, foolish even, to feel anything toward her beyond obligation. Yet as he watched her fight to cling to life, something inside him shifted. He realized he wasn't just repairing a body. He was keeping alive a will that refused to die, and in that defiance he saw a reflection of humanity itself. The following morning brought clarity and fear. Eli woke to the sound of distant engines, rumbling low across the valley. He scrambled to the window, heart racing, and spotted faint contrails cutting through the mist. Patrols. His stomach tightened. They were searching for survivors, for wreckage, for anything that might tie back to the battle. If they found the hangar, everything would end. He turned back to her, watching her fragile form against the table, and knew he couldn't let that happen. He began packing supplies, moving quickly but quietly. He gathered tools, spare parts, food rations, anything portable enough to matter. The decision crystallized with each movement. He couldn't stay here. The hangar was compromised, too exposed. If they found her, she'd be executed or worse, dissected. He couldn't allow that. He looked at her once more, still unconscious, and whispered, "We're leaving, like it or not." Moving her was a challenge he hadn't prepared for. Her body was heavier than it looked, partly from the crude alloy grafts, partly from whatever alien density her physiology carried. Eli rigged a stretcher from scrap and tied it to a repurposed cargo hauler. Each tug strained his muscles, sweat pouring down his back, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every minute wasted risked discovery. The engines in the distance grew louder, pressing him forward with ruthless urgency. By midday, he had her secured in the hauler, covered with tarps and hidden beneath piles of machinery to mask her outline. He glanced at her face one last time before sealing her in. Her eyes flickered open briefly, confusion clouding them, and Eli forced a smile. "Trust me," he muttered. He didn't know if she understood, but he hoped the tone carried more than the words. Then he started the hauler, its engine growling to life, and turned it toward the wilderness. The road ahead was unforgiving, little more than a scar through the mountains. Rocks jutted from the dirt, wheels slipping against mud, but Eli pressed on. Each bump made him wince, imagining what it did to her fragile state. He muttered apologies into the silence, though she couldn't hear him. The further they moved from the hangar, the more real the danger became. He was running, hiding, protecting something the world would never forgive him for. Night fell before he stopped, the hauler tucked into a ravine sheltered by jagged stone. Exhaustion threatened to crush him, but he forced himself to check on her first. Lifting the tarp, he found her staring at him, awake and watchful. Her glow was stronger now, her breathing steady. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the silence between them heavy but unbroken. Eli realized then that she understood enough. She knew he had risked everything to move her, and in her gaze he thought he saw something like gratitude. He offered her water again, and this time she drank without hesitation. The small act felt monumental. It was trust in its most fragile form. Eli sat beside her, shoulders aching, and let the silence stretch. He wanted to ask her name, to know who she was beyond the survivor he had patched together, but the words caught in his throat, tangled with exhaustion and fear. Instead, he leaned back against the hauler wall, whispering, "We'll figure it out, somehow." Sleep claimed him quickly, but not deeply. He dreamed again, of fire, of her eyes burning through smoke, of voices he couldn't understand but somehow knew were calling him. He woke with a start, sweat clinging to his skin, and found her still watching him. The glow of her eyes was faint in the darkness, like distant stars. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. It was terrifying, and it was the only thing that kept him going. When dawn broke, Eli knew the road ahead would only grow harder. But as he checked her pulse steadier than ever, and saw her prosthetic fingers curl with newfound strength, he felt a surge of defiance. He wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting for her, for himself, for the choice he had made when everyone else would have turned away. Humanity wasn't about winning wars or building empires. It was about refusing to abandon the ones who couldn't stand on their own. And in that, Eli knew he had already chosen his side. The road through the mountains grew harsher with each passing day, but Eli pressed forward, guided by instinct more than destination. He had no map, no plan, only the unyielding need to keep her hidden. The patrols overhead had grown more frequent, their engines rumbling like thunder across the sky. Each time they passed, Eli froze, his breath tight in his chest until the sound faded. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever, but he would buy every moment he could. The woman, though still weak, was regaining strength faster than he expected. She no longer drifted in and out of consciousness constantly. Her eyes followed him with sharp awareness, and her hands, both flesh and prosthetic, trembled less each day. She tried to speak often, repeating words he couldn't understand, growing frustrated when he failed to respond. Eli wished desperately he could bridge that gap, but language remained a wall between them. All he could offer was tone, gestures, and patience. On the third night, as they sheltered in a cave, she attempted something new. She tapped her chest with her good hand, her lips forming a single word clearly. She repeated it again, eyes locked on him as if demanding he remember. Eli frowned, then nodded slowly. "Your name?" he guessed. She tapped her chest once more, firmer this time, and spoke again. The sound was melodic despite its harsh edges, something between a whisper and a command. He repeated it clumsily, earning the faintest flicker of a smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile, however brief, and it disarmed him completely. He repeated the name again, slower, tasting the syllables until they felt almost right. She corrected him softly, and when he finally managed a passable attempt, her smile lingered a little longer. Eli tapped his own chest awkwardly. "Eli," he said. She tilted her head, studying him, then repeated it back with surprising accuracy. For a moment, the cave felt warmer, less hostile. A fragile bridge had been built. From then on, their attempts at communication became a ritual. She would point, gesture, speak, and Eli would mimic, butcher, and learn. Progress was halting but real. He discovered words for water, food, danger. She learned a handful of his in return, her tongue adapting quickly to the strange shapes. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to share the basics, enough to replace silence with meaning. Each breakthrough pulled them closer, weaving threads of trust through the gaps between them. By the end of the week, her body had adjusted more fully to the crude prosthetics. Eli had built them for survival, not elegance, but she treated them with a warrior's focus, testing each movement, pushing their limits. She practiced walking in the small clearings they found, stumbling, falling, then rising again with stubborn determination. Eli hovered nearby, ready to catch her, but she often shoved him away, pride flashing in her eyes. She refused pity. She demanded strength, and slowly strength returned. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, she stood unaided for the first time. Her steps were shaky, uneven, but her chin lifted with quiet triumph. Eli clapped softly, unable to contain his relief, and she glanced at him with something close to amusement. For the first time, he realized she wasn't just surviving. She was reclaiming herself piece by piece, and he was merely the hammer and nails she used to rebuild her foundation. The true fight was hers alone, but their progress came at a cost. Eli noticed her gaze often drifted skyward, lingering on the contrails of patrol ships, her expression dark and unreadable. She was remembering something, someone, lost in the wreckage he had found her in. He didn't ask. He knew enough of grief to recognize its weight. Instead, he gave her space, offering silence as a shield. At night, he would catch her staring into the fire, her jaw set as if swearing vows he couldn't hear. The further they traveled, the more the world pressed back against them. Food grew scarce, fuel for the hauler dwindled, and the patrols tightened their search. Once they were forced to hide beneath a collapsed bridge for an entire day, while searchlights swept the valley. Eli lay beside her, heart hammering while she gripped his arm with surprising strength, her breathing controlled and steady. When the patrols passed, he met her gaze, and in her eyes he saw no fear, only defiance. Their bond, fragile at first, hardened under the weight of shared danger. Eli found himself speaking to her more often, even when she couldn't understand. He told her about the mines where he'd wasted half his life, about the family he had lost to war and hunger, about the mistakes that had left him alone. She listened, silent but attentive, her eyes never wavering. Sometimes she responded with words he didn't know, her voice gentle, as if offering comfort in a language he couldn't decipher. One night, when exhaustion finally dragged him into a heavy sleep, he woke to find her covering him with a blanket. She moved stiffly, her prosthetics creaking, but the gesture was deliberate, tender. Eli froze, pretending to still sleep, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. For years he had lived without kindness, surviving on grit and solitude. Now this alien woman he barely understood had offered it freely. He didn't know what to do with that. By the second week, she was walking with confidence, her steps surer, her posture proud, despite the crude machinery grafted to her. She was no longer a patient but a partner, moving beside him rather than behind. Together they pushed further into the wilderness, away from patrol routes toward places even the military avoided. Eli didn't know where they were going, only that forward was safer than standing still. She didn't question him, though he could tell she carried a destination in her heart. Their fragile peace shattered one afternoon when a patrol drone caught them in open ground. The shriek of its engines split the sky, and Eli cursed, dragging her toward cover. She moved faster than he expected, her prosthetic legs carrying her with startling power. The drone swooped low, scanners flashing, and Eli raised his rifle, an old rusted thing barely fit for hunting. He fired anyway, the shot sparking against the drone's hull. It wasn't enough. The machine circled back, its weapons primed. Before Eli could fire again, she surged past him, her prosthetic arm extended, a hidden mechanism sparking to life with a charge he hadn't installed. She leapt, impossibly fast, and slammed the arm into the drone's side. The explosion was small but devastating, sending the machine spiraling into the ground in a burst of smoke and fire. She landed hard, rolling across the dirt, but rose to her feet with eyes blazing. Eli stared, stunned. She had just saved them both. Breathless, Eli rushed to her side, helping her steady herself. She winced but waved him off, muttering words sharp with pride. He recognized one of them, the word for warrior. She tapped her chest as she said it, then tapped his, repeating it again. Eli blinked, shaking his head. "I'm no warrior," he muttered. But she smiled faintly, as if she knew something he didn't. For the first time, he realized she was more than grateful. She respected him. The wreckage of the drone would draw attention. They had little time. Eli pushed them onward, adrenaline carrying him despite his exhaustion. She followed without complaint, her stride confident, her gaze sharp. Whatever weakness she had carried when he first found her was gone. She was rising, stronger with each day, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was rebirth. That night, as they camped in the shelter of a ravine, she sat close to him by the fire. The distance she once kept had vanished, replaced by a quiet companionship. She repeated his name again, testing its weight on her tongue, then spoke her own slowly until he could say it properly. When he finally managed it without stumbling, she laughed softly, a sound like breaking glass made beautiful. Eli felt something stir in his chest that scared him more than any patrol. The days that followed bound them tighter still. They moved as one, reading each other's gestures, anticipating each other's needs. Words remained limited, but understanding grew beyond language. Eli began to see her not just as someone he had saved, but as someone who was saving him in return, from solitude, from despair, from the weight of a world he had long stopped believing in. She was a reminder that even in ruin, something worth fighting for could be found. But beneath the fragile trust, danger loomed. The patrols were closing in, their presence heavier each day. Rumors on the radio crackled through stolen transmissions. An alien survivor had been spotted, and orders were clear: capture or kill. Eli's stomach twisted each time he heard it. They were hunting her and, by extension, him. And yet, Despite the fear gnawing at his bones, he found himself unwilling to let her go. He had chosen his side the moment he picked up his torch. One evening, as they rested beneath the stars, she pointed upward, tracing constellations with her finger. Her voice softened, filled with words he couldn't grasp, but he understood the tone, longing. Home. Eli followed her gaze, wondering how far her people were, if any remained alive. He wanted to promise her safety, to tell her she wasn't alone anymore, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. The silence between them grew heavy, charged but not uncomfortable. For Eli, it was enough. He had spent his life patching machines, repairing what others threw away. Now, for the first time, he felt like he was building something new. Not just prosthetics, not just survival, but a bond forged in fire and fear. It was fragile, imperfect, and dangerous, but it was real, and that terrified him more than anything else. By the time dawn came again, Eli knew their journey was leading towards something inevitable. The patrols wouldn't stop. The war wouldn't forget. Sooner or later, the world would catch up to them. But as he watched her stretch her new limbs in the early light, determination etched across her face, he felt a strange certainty settle in his chest. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in years, Eli was ready to fight. The morning air carried the scent of smoke long before Eli spotted its source. He crouched on a ridge, scanning the valley below, his stomach tightening as he saw the column of black rising from the trees. A military camp, temporary but efficient, nestled against the river bend. Searchlights swept lazily across the perimeter, and patrols circled like wolves. They were too close now. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to hide. But he knew they were running out of places to disappear. Behind him, she approached quietly, her steps steady on the rocky ground. She followed his gaze, eyes narrowing as she took in the camp. For a long moment, neither spoke. She broke the silence first, her voice low, deliberate. Danger. The word was still accented, foreign but clear enough. Eli nodded grimly. He wanted to tell her that danger had been shadowing them from the start, but he swallowed the thought. What mattered was what they would do about it now. She knelt beside him, tracing lines in the dirt with her prosthetic finger. Symbols sharp and angular, unfamiliar but purposeful. Eli frowned, trying to follow. She gestured to the camp, then to the symbols, her expression intent. Slowly he realized what she was doing, laying out a plan. It wasn't just survival she wanted anymore. It was confrontation. She was tired of running. Eli's pulse quickened at the thought. To stay meant certain risk, but to fight meant something more, a chance to reclaim control. He shook his head at first, muttering, "We can't, too many of them." But she met his gaze with fire in her eyes, tapping her chest, then his. "Warrior," she said firmly. The word cut through his hesitation like a blade. She wasn't asking. She was declaring. Eli exhaled, running a hand through his hair, torn between fear and the strange, relentless trust that had grown between them. Finally, with a weary nod, he whispered, "All right, together." That night they descended into the valley, moving like shadows between trees. Eli's heart thundered as they neared the camp, the glow of fires painting everything in harsh light. She moved ahead of him, surprisingly quiet despite the crude machinery fused to her body. Her instincts were sharp, precise, guiding them through blind spots he wouldn't have noticed. Eli realized then that whatever war she had come from, she was no stranger to this. Survival was not just her nature, it was her weapon. The first guard fell silently beneath her prosthetic arm, the metal crushing his throat before he could cry out. Eli froze at the brutality, but she didn't flinch. She glanced back at him, eyes hard, and he understood. This was the reality of her world and now his. They dragged the body into the shadows before slipping further inside. Each step carried them deeper into danger, but also closer to something Eli hadn't felt in years, purpose. Their goal revealed itself in the heart of the camp. A signal tower, tall and skeletal, pulsing with faint light. Eli recognized it instantly as a communications relay. That was how the patrols stayed coordinated, how the hunt stayed relentless. If they destroyed it, they would buy themselves time, days, maybe weeks. She pointed at the tower, then at herself, then at him. The plan was simple. She would create the opening. He would finish the job. It was madness. And yet Eli found himself nodding, They struck just before dawn when fatigue dulled the guard's edges. She moved first, a blur of strength and steel, tearing through the perimeter with ruthless efficiency. Alarms blared, soldiers shouting, weapons firing, but she was already among them, striking with mechanical precision. Eli sprinted for the tower, bullets whistling past, his lungs burning as he climbed the lattice. At the top he shoved charges, cobbled from scrap and desperation, into the relay's core. His hands shook, but he forced them steady. He couldn't fail now. The explosion ripped through the valley, fire consuming the tower in a violent bloom. Eli was thrown from the lattice, crashing hard onto the dirt below. Pain flared through his body, but he forced himself up, dazed just in time to see her standing in the chaos. Soldiers surrounded her, weapons trained, but she didn't yield. She fought like a storm, prosthetics sparking, movements fierce and unrelenting. Eli stumbled toward her, rifle in hand, firing blindly to break the circle. Together they carved their way out. They fled into the tree line as the camp dissolved into smoke and screams. Eli's chest heaved with exhaustion. His vision blurred, but adrenaline kept him moving. Beside him, she was bloodied but unbroken, her eyes burning with triumph. For the first time, they weren't running away. They had struck back. The realization hit Eli like a shock. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were fighters. And the war they had tried to outrun had finally caught up with them. They collapsed in a clearing miles away, the forest thick and silent around them. Eli dropped to his knees, gasping, while she leaned against a tree, one hand pressed to a wound along her side. He crawled to her, panic flooding him. "No, stay with me," he muttered, pressing rags against the injury. She winced but caught his wrist, shaking her head. "Live," she whispered, her accent heavy but her meaning clear. She was telling him to survive even if she didn't. Eli refused. He tore strips from his shirt, binding the wound as best he could. "Don't you dare," he growled, his voice breaking. "I didn't drag you back from death just to lose you now." Her gaze softened, a flicker of something fragile beneath the warrior's fire. She reached up, brushing her fingers against his cheek, clumsy with the prosthetic, gentle with the flesh. It was the closest thing to a thank you he had ever felt. And it nearly broke him. The days that followed were brutal. They moved slower, hiding deeper in the wilderness, always listening for the hum of patrols. Eli supported her when she faltered, though she rarely allowed it for long. Her pride wouldn't permit weakness. But at night, when the firelight flickered against her face, he could see the toll it was taking, the scars, the strain, the endless fight, and yet she never complained. She only endured, carrying herself with the same unyielding defiance that had first drawn him to her. One evening, as they rested beneath a canopy of stars, she spoke more words than ever before. Her sentences were broken, halting, but Eli caught enough to understand. She told him of a home long gone, a people scattered, a war she had lost long before she crashed on his world. Her voice trembled, not with fear but with sorrow. Eli listened in silence, his chest aching with the weight of it. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the last fragment of something greater,